What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to the Art Hack. Tonight we're going to be continuing a little bit of sculpting. I'm not going to be talking much. Just going to kind of continue working on this sculpture of Jesus, not this Batman. Get this loaded up. I'm going to sculpt and listen in on a documentary. You guys can chill with me if you want. So here we are. This is where we were last time. I'm going to work on this hair, a little bit of the beard, and we'll see how long that takes. Maybe work on this area here, and that should be enough work for tonight. So been watching a documentary on the Shroud of Turin that I'm gonna pull up here in a moment, and we can all hang out and learn some things.
How to open your car door while submerged underwater. A fatal construction flaw in all recent automobiles.
For those of you who don't know, the Shroud of Turin is an ancient relic believed by many to be the burial cloth of Jesus described in the Gospels. And Joseph took the body and wrapped it in a clean linen cloth. And of course, the cloth resurfaces after the resurrection when Peter and John enter the tomb. So Simon Peter also came, following him, and he entered the tomb, and he looked at the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but folded up in a place by itself. So the other disciple, who had first come to the tomb, also entered then, and he saw and believed. This is a very interesting passage. It refers to two different cloths, a face cloth and the linen wrapping. It was upon seeing these things the Apostle John believed Jesus was resurrected. There's something about these cloths that helped him believe. And later in this video, we will discuss what it may have been about these cloths that indicated a resurrection had taken place. For those of you who aren't aware, the Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth with two features that are immediately visible to the naked eye. First, it has the faint, full-scale image of a man with arms crossed over his waist, an image of the man's front and his back. Second, the cloth appears to contain numerous bloodstains. In 1898, an Italian photographer, Secondo Pia, made a startling discovery. While developing the first photographs taken of a shroud, he saw that his film's negative image was an anatomically perfect, positive image of a man. Now, if the negative of the image is a positive, then the image itself must be a negative. A very interesting finding that we will explain later as well. Now, before we begin to analyze the new evidence as to whether or not this is the image of Jesus and whether he was moving at the time it was made, both astonishing pieces of information, let's discuss the old evidence first. You may have heard that radiocarbon dating proved the shroud was a medieval forgery. This data came out in 1998, and a major media blitz followed, supposedly debunking the shroud. The major theory at that time was it was a painted forgery by a medieval artist. However, it seems the choice of the samples taken for testing may have come from a medieval repair of the cloth rather than the image-bearing cloth itself. At least 4 scholarly articles have been published on this problem with the previous carbon-14 testing. One of the original experts who tested the shroud became aware of this problem. He retested the shroud and found the original results were in error. The sampled section was the worst possible section to study. Then in 2017, after a Freedom of Information Act request released all the data from the first test, it was discovered that additionally some of the data from the original test was withheld to doctor the results. Because of this, the original test must be discounted entirely. So if the radiocarbon test is invalid, is there any evidence for the age of the shroud? The most extensive battery of experiments was conducted by the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Back in 1978, the group of 24 experts and scientists included Christians, Jews, and atheists. The project issued a final report that was summarized this way, quote, "We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved." If you notice, their research proved that no pigments of any kind were added to the image area of the cloth. Thus, it was not a painted or drawn forgery. They concluded it was a photographic image of some sort, even though it was on a non-photosensitive medium, linen cloth. But how it formed, they were unsure. Later in this video, we'll discuss this because the ideas that are presented are simply amazing. Other tests were done. Images of flowers are seen on the shroud's image. It appears the body was covered with flowers as a sign of affection prior to burial. Botanist Avinoam Danin of the Hebrew Institute of Jerusalem determined where the shroud originated based on a comprehensive analysis of the pollen taken from the shroud and the plant images associated with it. Much of the pollen is native only to the area around Jerusalem, and some are not still in existence, which dates the cloth to no later than AD 800. This combination of flowers can be found in only one region of the world, Danin stated. The evidence clearly points to a floral grouping from the area surrounding Jerusalem. Analysis of minute particles of limestone, also found adhering to the shroud, have been identified by Dr. Joseph Kolbeck as a rare form of travertine aragonite. This stone is also only found in Jerusalem, and it's the same as samples from ancient Jerusalem tombs taken by archaeologist Eugenia Nitkowski. So this places the shroud in Jerusalem in a tomb. Those who claim this is some kind of medieval forgery cannot explain these connections to Jerusalem. The blood on the shroud is human, and it happens to be blood type AB, which is rare in most places but common in Israel. And this blood is positioned exactly where the wounds of Jesus were, on his wrists, feet, and the side where the spear pierced him, and on his head where the crown of thorns was placed. In fact, the image shows this horrible crown was still in place when he was buried. Based on the image, it is a Sarcopterygium cynosium, which is more commonly called the thorny burnet. Rather than being woven into a wreath like the crown we usually see in paintings, it appears the Romans just took branches of this plant and forced it into a cap shape on his head. This is yet another reason that the shroud can't be a forgery, as medieval artists would have gone with the conventional picture of a wreath-like crown, not this cap of thorns that no one expected to see. There's dirt on the soles of the victim's feet, on his knees, and nose. And the nose of the victim was broken. This seems to indicate the victim may have fallen, prior to being crucified and broke and skinned the nose in the process. The victim, carrying a crossbeam, wouldn't have had his hands free to break the fall, so if he fell, his nose would take the brunt. We know that on the way to Calvary, Jesus began carrying his own cross. But sometime later, Simon of Cyrene was conscripted by the Romans to help Jesus carry it. Now, a fall or a collapse that could have broken the nose of the man on the image may have been what caused this man to require help. New carbon dating tests by scientists at the University of Padua in northern Italy used the same fibers from the 1988 test but got different findings. The new examination dates the shroud somewhere between 300 BC to 480, which would put it in the era of Christ.
All over the earth, God is raising up a new breed of wealth builders who will use their money to shape the course of world history without building a golden calf. You see,
But the greatest evidence that this was the burial cloth of Jesus is the image itself and how it was created. First, the image is superficial. It lies just on the top of the microfibers, something we can't achieve even today with modern science. There was no bleed through like you would expect with paints or dyes. In other words, the image didn't go down into the fibers like paint would or a dye. It stayed right on the very surface. Although the blood did bleed through the cloth with capillary action, the image itself was seared onto the cloth just at the top. Second, the image is a three-dimensional, almost hologram type formation, and there is no other image in the world like this. There are no 2D images in the world that carry 3D information. The darker areas of the image were closer to the cloth and the lighter areas further away. This captured the 3D information about the image. Scientists actually have used this 3D information and have even made a sculpture of the man in the image. Third, the image is a negative, not a positive. No one would paint a negative or backwards image in the 1300s. So for all these reasons, it cannot be a forgery. However, how did the image form? Scientists believe it was a burst, or as we will explain in a second, oscillating bursts of high intensity, single wavelength light, laser light. This is a technology we simply don't have today. Light can create the type of brownish image that exists on the shroud. Just put a newspaper in your window for 2 weeks and you will see it turn this type of yellow-brown. However, it will not form an image like that of the shroud, but the basic idea is the same. Light desiccates and oxidizes the outer layers of the paper or the fabric. But how did it produce an image? The answer is that the light came from inside the body of the man in the image, and it traveled in all directions in exact parallel lines. That's laser light, those exact parallel lines. Scientists have estimated the power to produce this type of image exceeds all the electrical power generated in the entire Earth at one time. It is only possible supernaturally. But this isn't the most amazing aspect of a shroud image. The International Institute for Advanced Studies of Space Representation scientists in Paloma, Italy, have presented research that the body of the man was in motion when the image was produced. Yes, you heard me right. The body appears to have been moving. Now we know that because the image isn't a single exposure, but a combination of multiple exposures, sort of the way a strobe light photography can follow the path of a tennis ball or a golf swing. The image on the shroud shows various objects in motion, like the nails in the man's wrist and feet, the teflon on his arms, and his belt buckle moving up and down with his breath. The Italian Institute's research shows that multiple exposures of these very easy to track items on the body of the man are present in different positions, showing that his hands and feet and His chest, when he breathed, were moving.
That's absolutely
Current
crazy.
theory is that the light that produced the image was oscillating, producing light in bursts, just like a strobe light would. This accounts for the multiple exposures, one with each burst of light, which in turn accounts for why certain areas of the shroud image are somewhat fuzzy. Movement would make those areas seem out of focus. Now, how could the body of a dead man be moving in the image? This was obviously a burial shroud. The eyes of the man are closed and covered with coins or buttons. So if this is Jesus and he is moving, it is the exact moment of the resurrection prior to him opening his eyes. Can you see why God might want to keep evidence such as that to share with the world? But where did the light come from? This is something that no one can answer other than Jesus himself. One theory is that it came from his DNA activating. It's an interesting theory. Studies from as far back as 1984 show that active DNA produces laser light, but of very low intensity. Now, the DNA of God might have quite a different intensity, like we said, greater than all the electricity on Earth. It is also thought that the body was levitating at the moment the image was being made. And as we know, the resurrection body of Jesus was able to pass through solid objects like the door of the upper room where the disciples were hiding. This could explain why John believed when he saw the burial cloth of Jesus. Had the body of Jesus actually passed directly through this cloth without it having even been opened? And was it lying unopened but empty in the tomb? Now, another theory is that John saw the image of his Lord on the cloth, the Shroud of Turin, the same image we're talking about today. Now, either theory could account for John's reaction. But you know what? I bet you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, Nelson. You've been going on and on. But what was that you said about nails, coins, and a belt buckle? And what's a tefillin? Are all these things on the image of the shroud? The answer is yes, they are. And a whole lot more. If this is the body of our Lord, which seems the only possible explanation, these details tell us a great deal about what he suffered, what he wore, etc. Click right here to keep watching to learn about all the items found on the body of the man on the image of the shroud and what they might tell us about Jesus and his life. This is Nelson.
5 words you pronounce
Sure,
wrong
check it out.
2 years before your brain starts shutting down.
This is what I do while I
The
sculpt.
famous
Just
Shroud of
listen to
Turin
all
image
kinds
has
of stuff.
sparked worldwide debate for the last 40 years. Now, that debate is about whether the man in the image is Jesus. But what is almost never discussed are the multitude of hidden items that are found in the image, like a belt, coins, nails, tefillin, the crown of thorns, and even a ponytail. If this image is Jesus, what do these items tell us about him and his religious practices, his daily life, how he was crucified, how he was buried? That's what we're
So what I'm
talking
trying
about
to do
today,
right now
and we're
is,
starting
set the rhythms of the
right
hair.
now. Obviously, the central question regarding the shroud is whether or not this is Jesus. In the previous video in this series, we discussed the evidence for and against that in detail. We also described theories on how this amazing 3D image might have been formed with laser light that came from his body, and the intriguing theory that the man in the image, the previously dead man, was moving. The link to that video is down in the description below this video. And if that man is Jesus, it makes all these items in the image much more important. And for the sake of this video, from this point on, we're going to assume it was Jesus. So what about these items? For instance, many first century men might have had a ponytail, but if Jesus did, what does that mean? And why didn't he cut his hair? But before we begin looking at the items one at a time, let's examine the events immediately prior to Jesus' image ending up on that linen cloth. Now, after these things, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jesus, but a secret one for fear of the Jews, requested to Pilate that he might take away the body of Jesus, and Pilate granted permission. So he came and took away his body. Nicodemus, who had first come to him at night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, about 100 liters weight. And they took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen wrappings with the spices, as is the burial custom of the Jews. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden was a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. Therefore, because of the Jewish day of preparation, since the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. So Joseph and Nicodemus took Jesus' body down from the cross. And there is an artifact that remains on the image of this process. There was a strap tied around the waist of Jesus, running down between his legs and up the other side, visible on the image. This strap was used by Joseph and Nicodemus to hold and support the body as it was taken down off the cross as they pulled the nails out of the wood. They kept him suspended by means of this cloth so that the body would not fall on the ground. This cloth strip was obviously left behind in the tomb after the resurrection and has been sewn onto the side of the shroud. And yes, part of the image was made on this cloth, and experts have determined how the strap was positioned. Notice we said the nails were removed from the cross. Interestingly, they were not removed from the body of Jesus because they appear on the image. In our previous video on the shroud, we discussed that the image is actually a series of exposures, almost the way a strobe light photography picture works. And in this series of images, they show us that the body was moving. Nails were one of the artifacts that were easy to trace over the various exposures and showed the feet rotated about 90 degrees during the image making process, and that the hands began to undo something, possibly the Teflon or perhaps a chain that was seen on Jesus's one arm. And the nail holes also show us where on the body they were applied. Now, much discussion about the position of the nails, palm versus wrist, foot versus ankle, have taken place over the years in Christian circles, but the image on the shroud, if it's Jesus, pretty much answers the question. And in the shroud image, the nails were driven into the wrist of the victim because this was an area which could support the weight of the body. If the palms were used, the flesh would tear and the body would fall off. And the nails were driven through the feet, not the ankles, even though this channel understands that ankle bones have been found with nails in them. Maybe there were different styles of crucifixion, but the image on the shroud shows the nail in the foot. A common practice in the ancient world was to place small, inexpensive coins over the eyes of a deceased to keep them closed during burial. And the image definitively shows small round objects over Jesus' eyes. As we mentioned in the previous video, the fact that these objects are still on his eyes in the image and that his eyes are closed indicates the image was created at the very first moments of the resurrection. His first movements seem to have been moving his hands and feet and breathing. Potentially, he opened his eyes later. Some experts have attempted to identify the coins on Jesus' eyes, and the best guess seems to be that they are the widow's mite, made famous in Luke 21. On the disc covering the right eye apparently is a lituus, a curved argural staff used in the Roman religion. And on the disc over his left eye, we find a sacrificial cup. So it appears two different coins were used. Besides these images, researchers have managed to read the letters YKI in the coins. This is thought to be the visible part of the word Tiberoi kaikopok, Greek for Tiberius Caesar, that is, Emperor Tiberius, a numismatist. Agostino Stephazzar dates them to the time of Pontius Pilate, and specifically to the year 29 AD. That was the year they were minted. If this is accurate, it eliminates the year AD 28 as a possible date for the crucifixion, which of course is popular with some scholars. Now this isn't guaranteed, this isn't assured, but it sure seems to support a later crucifixion date.
Have you heard about this device that can cool down rooms in a matter of minutes without using massive amounts of electricity?
It's also interesting that Jesus was wearing a garment known as a corazon in the image. It was held in place with a snakeskin belt. Tradition has always claimed that the Romans crucified their victims naked, but this finding seems to contradict this. It would be very unlikely that Joseph and Nicodemus would have placed this tight-fitting undergarment after the death of the Lord. Also, the blood from the spear wound flowed out of his side, ran to the back, and collected around the belt line of this corazon. That also points to this corazon being in place when Jesus received the spear wound. These garments, corazons, were common in the Middle East since the time of Moses and traditionally were held in place with a snakeskin belt. And sure enough, the pattern of the belt in the image seems to match up with a species of North African python. How interesting is that? There is a circular belt buckle that is seen in two different positions in the various exposures of the image. This movement may indicate Jesus' very first breath after the resurrection. Amazing. I love that. The crown of thorns is visible on Jesus' head, front and back, even to the untrained eye, but it is quite different than that pictured in artworks. The traditional idea of a crown of thorns is a braided wreath of a thorny vine, but what is pictured on the image is more like a cap of thorns. The plant has been identified as the thorny burnet. The leaves and fruit of this plant are visible in the image as well. It appears the Roman soldiers just cut off a branch of this bush and simply shoved it down on Jesus' head. The image shows that the horrible thorns produce numerous puncture wounds on our Lord's scalp. Another item, a fascinating item, that is visible to the unaided eye is an oval that is visible beneath the beard of our Messiah. This was likely suspended by a strap or a string or a necklace, and 3 Hebrew letters are pictured on this oval: Ayin, Aleph, Nun. In Aramaic, these letters spell the word lamb. I mean, you can't make this up. Jesus wore a necklace that pronounced him the Lamb of God? It appears so. And notice that just like the corazon, it seems the Romans did not remove this necklace, and Jesus wore it throughout the crucifixion. Now, why would that be? Probably because a necklace with Jewish letters on it had no value to the Romans. The image is also clear that Jesus was wearing a tefillin, or phylacteries. Like many Jewish men of his time, he wore an armed tefillah, which was a small box containing scripture and was held on by a decorative strap wound around his arm and fingers. The phylacteries were to remind the men of that day to follow the law. In the image, the strap had diamond-shaped holes in it for decoration. The image also shows Jesus wearing one on his forehead. Again, it seems the Romans allowed Jesus to wear these religious items throughout the crucifixion. Jesus criticized the Pharisees for making their phylacteries bigger and more noticeable. And they do all their deeds to be noticed by other people, for they broaden their phylacteries and lengthen the tassels of their garments. I don't think I have ever seen an artwork or a painting where Jesus is wearing tefillin, but it is obvious from the shroud that if this is Jesus, he did. So Jesus was criticizing the Pharisees for wearing large or exaggerated phylacteries, but it seems that he was not opposed to the idea at all, contrary to most Christian thought. And that is not the most controversial thing about this image. Jesus has shoulder-length hair, side locks, and a ponytail that extended halfway down his back. Some of our viewers have criticized this channel for presenting pictures of Jesus in our videos with longer hair, saying that men wore shorter hair in those days. But again, based on the image of the shroud, this was not true of our Lord. Paul teaches in Corinthians, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? So the question becomes, why would Jesus have longer hair if it's a disgrace? He may have taken a Nazirite vow. All the days of his vow of consecration, no razor shall pass over his head. He shall be holy until the days are fulfilled, which he lives as a Nazirite for the Lord. He shall let the locks of his hair on his head grow long. The vow is a desire to yield to God completely. By definition, the Hebrew word Nazir simply means to be separated or consecrated. Samuel, Samson, and John the Baptist all took these vows. It would also be logical that Jesus would make such a vow as well. The presence of a tefillin and the possible Nazirite vow really shows that Jesus was fulfilling every aspect of the Mosaic covenant law, an aspect of our Lord that is completely overlooked by our Christian society today. We need to keep these things in mind. And a related question many ask is whether we should call our Lord Jesus or Yeshua, his Hebrew name. If we call on either name, will it save, or is it a sin to call our Lord by his English name, Jesus? There's a lot of controversy about this. Click right here to see our channel examine this question and learn what Hebrews in the first century might have called him.
It's interesting information. Definitely go for sculpture.
And mocking and beating him. It is a rectangular linen cloth measuring approximately 4.4 meters by 1.1 meters. It is kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, since 1578. The image on the shroud can only be seen if someone stands about 6 feet, or 2 meters distant from it. In the front image, one can see a face framed by long hair and a thick beard, the chest, and the arms crossed over the pubis with legs extended. The back image shows the nape, the back, legs extended, and the soles of the feet. The shroud is made of fine linen, with a characteristic herringbone weave. On enlargement, the herringbone weave can be clearly recognized. According to the Gospels, Jesus was beaten, his beard ripped off, scourged, crowned with thorns, then he carried his cross, and was nailed to the cross, died, and pierced by a spear by a Roman soldier. In Luke 22 verses 62 to 65 we read, the men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy. Who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. On the shroud, we see a large hematoma on his right cheek, probably a broken nose, and most remarkably, in Isaiah 50:6b it says, "I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard." This is a messianic prophecy. Nowhere do the Gospels mention that the Roman soldiers pluck off his beard, but on the shroud we can clearly see a part of his beard missing. The man on the shroud bears numerous contusive injuries that have been carefully studied by forensic doctors. The right side of his face appears more swollen than the left, with visible hematomas and contused lacerations. Numerous sinuous bloodstains can be seen on his forehead, the back of his neck, and throughout his hair, emanating from small wounds with pointed diameters. These stains radiate out from his head in a spoke-like pattern, suggesting that a helmet of sharp, pointed thorns was pressed onto his head. The sinuous bloodstains on his forehead, neck, and hair suggest that the subject had a helmet of thorns pressed onto his head, causing small pointed wounds. The spoke-like pattern of the stains radiating from the head indicates the uniformity of the injury, possibly caused by the same object. The characteristics of the bloodstains allow for distinguishing between injuries to arterial and venous vessels. The bloodstain on the center of the forehead flowing from a wound in the frontal vein is particularly interesting as it takes on the shape of an inverted 3, as it follows the contours of the forehead. This type of bloodstain pattern can be useful in identifying the direction and force of the injury. The abrasions on the chest, back, and lower limbs consisting of round, approximately 2 centimeters long figures suggest injuries caused by a flagellum, a Roman torture instrument consisting of a wooden handle with cords at the end to which small metal balls were attached. The punishment was inflicted on a bent back and naked body, causing over 100 such injuries. The detailed examination of the bloodstains and injuries on the subject's body provides valuable insights into the manner of his death and the torture he endured. At the height of the left scapular area and the right suprascapular area, quadrangular bruises can be observed. These marks are believed to have been left by the patibulum, the horizontal beam of the cross that the condemned sometimes carried on himself to the place of execution. The object was likely heavy and rough, causing the bruises to be quadrangular in shape. The long bloodstains on both forearms that appear to run upwards are actually formed when the body was hung on the cross, and therefore the wrists were higher than the elbows. The characteristic bloodstain on the left wrist formed by 2 divergent streaks is particularly noteworthy as it indicates 2 different positions assumed by the condemned on the cross. The blood flows from an oval-shaped wound caused by a pointed instrument, such as a nail. Particular attention should be paid to the location of this wound, which is not in the palm of the hand as depicted in the traditional iconography of crucifixion, but in the wrist. Following is a point of interest, namely in every single medieval painting of Jesus' crucifixion, the nails are always in the center of the palm. Yet we know now based on the physical structure of the bones in the hand that a nail in that location would simply rip out through the fingers. It would not sufficiently carry the weight of the crucifixion victim. Interestingly, the shroud is different from every piece of medieval artwork in this detail in that it places the nails at the wrist. Not only is this different, but it's also physiologically possible. That means that the shroud is more medically and physiologically accurate than every piece of medieval crucifixion artwork. The content of the shroud is consistent with the biblical passion narrative. Interestingly, the shroud is different from every piece of medieval artwork in this detail in that it places the nails at the wrist. Not only is this different, but it's also physiologically possible. That means that the shroud is medically and physiologically more accurate than every piece of medieval crucifixion artwork. It is noteworthy that the image of the thumbs is absent from the shroud, which could be due to damage to the median nerve or tetanic contraction. On the right side of his chest, there is a large bloodstain that flows from an oval-shaped wound caused by a pointed and sharp object that struck between the 5th and 6th ribs, penetrating deeply. The characteristics of this wound indicate that it was inflicted after the man's death. Jesus was crucified without clothing. He was flogged. He had a crown of thorns placed on his head. He was slapped and beaten in the face, and his beard was ripped off. Jesus' legs were not broken. His hand, feet, and side were pierced. The man in the shroud had developed rigor mortis. The forearm blood flow was consistent with outstretched arm held up and out. The thumbs were flexed due to nerve damage at the wrist. The mid-torso blood flow was post-mortem and originated from a major artery or organ. And the man carried a heavy load on his shoulders after the initial scourging. All of these details only further expand on the correlation between the content of the shroud and the biblical passion narrative. All the wounds that can be seen on the Shroud of Turin coincide with the ones described in the Gospels, inflicted on Jesus. How was the image on the shroud made? It's not a painting. If this were true, it should be possible to identify the pigments used by chemical analysis, just as conservators can do for the paintings of old masters. But there is no evidence of any pigments on the cloth in sufficient amounts to explain the image. Nor are there any signs of it being rendered in brush strokes. Can you imagine that a talented artist would have painted the image, on the right, and would have obtained by an extraordinary chance the wonderful highly realistic image, which is in fact related to the unique three-dimensional characteristic of the shroud image, seen on the right, the negative photograph, without having in mind even the possibility to imagine such effect? The shroud image is not created by any paint stain or dye. It's not due to oil or bodily composition. It's not caused by acid powder or heat. Interestingly, there's no material, whether organic or inorganic, deposited on the shroud to form the image. The image does not crack at the fold lines, and there's no difference in spatial distribution when viewing the image in the infrared spectrum when compared with the visible spectrum, a feature present in brushed paintings. If we look closely at the threads of the shroud themselves, we observe an interesting phenomenon. Each thread consists of many microscopic fibrils. And in the blood-stained areas of the shroud, the blood wicks through all of the fibrils by capillary action, meaning we can see the blood stains on the back of the shroud. However, the image is present only on the topmost fibrils, indicating a lack of capillary action. And this is interesting because it is not physically possible to apply any sort of liquid paint, stain or dye to the shroud without it wicking through to the back side through capillary action, so we know for certain that the image could not have been formed through any sort of liquid applied to the surface. The entire image is very superficial in nature, around 0.002 of a millimeter only on the uppermost surface of the fibrils. The inner side is not. Thus it could not have been formed by chemicals. The image resides on the outermost layer of the linen fibers. The image was not made by a natural chemical process. The image is the result of oxidation, dehydration, and conjugation of the fibers of the shroud themselves. It is like the imaged areas on the shroud suddenly rapidly aged compared to the rest of the shroud. The image on the shroud is the only one of its kind in this world, and there are no known methods that can account for the totality of the image, nor can any combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances explain the image adequately. So then, what does cause the image to appear on the surface of the shroud? The fibrils are darkened because the cellulose molecules and the flax fibrils have been chemically altered. There are carbon atoms in the cellulose molecule which under normal circumstances share a single electron bond, but the darkened fibrils contain cellulose molecules in which the carbon atoms have a double electron bond. The question is, what can produce the net effect of the image of the shroud? We've experimentally determined that heat can induce the molecular change in the flax fibrils. However, heat cannot create shaded regions with an equal extent of fibril change, and it cannot create a 3D depth map unless we change some fibrils more than others. We have absolutely no idea how a medieval artist could have used a controlled radiation source to create the image in the shroud. In fact, we do not even possess this ability today. The previously cited result comes from simulation only, because even with our advanced technology today we cannot reproduce the image with all of the same chemical effects we observe in the shroud. In fact, so far the only process which has been able to produce all of the chemical effects of the fibrils and results in a 3D depth map of a man on the linen is radiation. But if radiation is in fact the best explanation for how the image was formed, that raises some big questions. A burst of 34,000 billion watts of VUV radiation produced a discoloration on the uppermost surface of the shroud surface, which gave rise to a perfect three-dimensional negative image. We currently do not know of any natural cause for a human corpse producing ultraviolet radiation like this. A very short and intense flash of directional VUV radiation can color the linen fabric. The total power required to instantly color the surface of linen corresponding to a human body is 34,000 billion watts. According to normal burial proceedings in the 1st century, the body, after a ritual washing, was dressed in a kittel, shroud, called takrachit, as shown in the picture. But in the case of Jesus, there was not enough time. So the shroud was probably just wrapped and laid over his body, as shown in the image above. Some researchers have suggested that the image on the shroud could only have been formed by orthogonal, unidirectional rays, which means that the light that created the image would have had to come from a single source and hit the cloth at right angles. This theory is based on the fact that the image on the shroud is only visible from a certain angle, and appears to be three-dimensional, as if it were formed by a beam of light hitting the cloth from a single point. Experiments by physicist Arthur Linde in 2017 using a cyclotron at the University of Missouri demonstrated that the radiation had to be extremely fine-tuned within a very narrow range of parameters in order to produce the image of the shroud, otherwise the shroud could have been burnt through, or if too many of the fibers had been colored it would have left only a dark area instead of an image, or if the radiation source was too weak or too far away from the cloth it would not have left any. Radiation effect. According to some biophysicists, particle radiation irradiated the shroud and the source of the particle radiation was the body itself. The source of the illumination that had formed the image came from within, that is, from the body as a whole. In other words, the radiation did not come from some external source, rather, the radiation's origin was directly from the body, from every pinpoint location of the body. During the resurrection the shroud probably fell through the disappearing dematerializing body while matter turned into energy. So as the body dematerialized, gravity took the shroud through the dematerializing body and fell through the body. Next, we will deal with the blood found on the shroud. Traces of human blood were found, and tests confirmed that this blood belonged to a human body at the time of death, and the blood type is most likely AB. The stains were formed by real human bleeding from real wounds on a real human body that came into direct contact with the cloth. Tests confirmed the presence of albumin, immunoglobulin, hemoglobina, and various antigens. But most interesting, the blood material also tested positive for the bile pigment bilirubin. In the context of forensic investigations, the presence of bilirubin in blood evidence could potentially be an indication of trauma or injury, including injury sustained during torture. Bilirubin may be released into the bloodstream as a result of the breakdown of red blood cells in damaged tissues, including bruising or other types of trauma. Included in these innumerable bloodstains are at least 100 tiny dumbbell-shaped scourge marks on the body and legs of the man on the shroud, which match wounds caused by a Roman flagrum with 2 lead balls on the end of each of its 3 thongs, evidently designed to cause internal bleeding so a crucifixion victim didn't die too soon of blood loss. Each of those scourge wounds has tiny blood clots which each have a serum retraction halo, clearly visible in ultraviolet light but barely visible, and some are invisible to the naked eye. Therefore a medieval forger would not only require a modern knowledge of the physiology of clot retraction, but would have to produce images of serum rings that are clearly evident only under ultraviolet light, which was only discovered in 1801. Even to this day, no artist, physician, or scientist has ever yet been able to reproduce, or otherwise transfer such microscopic precision of wounds from a body to a different object to date, much less to accomplish this flawlessly for over 100 scourge wounds. Next, we will give a closer look to the cumulative evidence that corroborates the shroud's authenticity. In 1898 Secondo Pia, an Italian amateur photograph, took the first official photograph of the shroud. Having exposed 4 photographic plates, he returned to his studio and began the process of developing them. What Pia saw that night in his darkroom astounded him. For, as the image on the negative plate took shape before his eyes, he found himself staring at a coherent likeness of a crucified man. Instead of the flat, enigmatic image seen on the cloth, the negative plate gave the impression of a substantial figure emerging from the background, a figure that looked like a real human body. The negative revealed a remarkably convincing, three-dimensional image of man's face, his eyelids closed. It was as if the shroud itself was a photographic negative that could be developed into a breathtaking, positive image of the crucified Jesus. Pia reported, "I experienced a very strong emotion when, during the development, I saw for the first time the holy face appear on the plate, with such clarity that I was dumbfounded by it. The image on the shroud appears as a negative image, like a negative of a photograph, and has most likely been formed by the imprint of the body that had been wrapped in the cloth after death." Then, further, in 1976 a team of American scientists led by Dr. John Jackson discovered that the shroud contains 3D information. They used a VP-8 image analyzer, which was a device originally developed by NASA to enhance images of the Moon's surface. The VP-8 image analyzer uses a mathematical algorithm to convert variations in brightness in a 2D image into height information, creating a 3D representation of the image. When Dr. Jackson and his team applied the VP-8 image analyzer to photographs of the Shroud of Turin, they discovered that the image on the shroud contained 3D information. The 3D information was particularly clear when the image was analyzed using a technique called the relief shading technique, which involves illuminating the image from different angles to create shadows that highlight variations in height. This discovery of 3D information on the Shroud of Turin was a significant breakthrough, as it provided new insights into the nature of the image and suggested that it was not a simple painting or forgery. In 2012, Thierry Castex from France made these 3D images based on the 3D information contained in the Shroud of Turin. In 2018, researchers in Padua, Italy, unveiled a 3D carbon copy of what the man on the shroud looked like based on the precise measurements of the cloth. The researchers used sophisticated 3D imaging technology to create a replica of the face on the Shroud of Turin, which they believe provides a more accurate representation of what Jesus may have looked like. The photonegative image and 3D information on the Shroud of Turin are cumulative evidence of its authenticity because they provide unique and unexplained characteristics that are difficult to replicate or explain by forgers or natural processes. In 1978, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, often abbreviated as STURP, made a scientific examination of the Shroud of Turin. It was performed by an international team of experts. For 5 consecutive 24-hour days, they used the latest technology to study the front and back image. This group of experts, working together, performed the first ever in-depth, multidisciplinary scientific examination of the shroud. They produced the primary database of credible scientific information about the shroud. They published over 30 peer-reviewed scientific articles, and it has become an essential resource for the ongoing research done by every serious shroud scholar today. The shroud has become the most scientifically studied textile and artifact in human history. STURP issued its final report in 1981. We can conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. The image is an ongoing mystery, and until further chemical studies are made, perhaps by this group of scientists, or perhaps by some scientists in the future, the problem remains unsolved. Barry Schwartz was a member of the team. STURP issued its final report in 1981. Schwartz confessed, "At the beginning of my work, I was very skeptical about its authenticity. I felt no particular emotion toward Jesus because I was raised as an Orthodox Jew. The only thing I knew about Jesus was that he was a Jew, and this was all. After 18 years of study, the full conviction came when, the blood chemistry Alan Adler, another Jew who was part of the study group, I explained why the red blood remained on the shroud. The old blood would have to be black or brown, while the blood on the shroud is a red crimson. It seemed inexplicable. Instead, it was the last piece of the puzzle. After nearly 20 years of investigation, it was a shock for me to discover that the piece of cloth was the authentic cloth that had been wrapped the body of Jesus. The conclusions I arrived at were based exclusively on scientific observation. Could the Shroud of Turin be a forgery? The claim that the shroud is a forgery is still widely made today. Some have attempted to reproduce the image on the shroud, with more or less success. For example, Italian chemist Luigi Garlascelli tried to reproduce the image of the shroud in 2008, but the results are a far cry from the image on the shroud, as can be seen here. These reproduction attempts do not come even close to the detailed image on the shroud, and rather than proving that the shroud was a forgery, they prove that reproducing the image on the shroud is not possible by traditional known methods. In April 2022, Joanna Moorhead wrote an article for the newspaper The Guardian, The $1 Million Challenge, If the Turin Shroud is a Forgery, Show How It Was Done. She reported about David Rolfe, a filmmaker. Rolfe issued a challenge worth $1 million to the British Museum. If they believe the shroud is a medieval forgery, I call on them to repeat the exercise, and create something similar today, he said. The British Museum is less willing to get involved this time around. Any current questions about the shroud would be best put to those who currently care for it in the Royal Chapel of the Cathedral of Turin, a spokesperson said. Professor William Meacham, an archaeologist at the University of Hong Kong who has researched the shroud for over 40 years, describes the shroud as the most intriguing object in the world. He wrote, "The Shroud of Turin poses one of the truly abiding mysteries of all archaeological and art historical artifacts. It is the world's most famous textile, and probably also the most intensively studied object in existence. Contrary to those that dispute this fact, this is factually true." Nature magazine stated, "The Shroud of Turin is the single, most studied artifact in human history." Joe Marino, world-renowned syndologist, wrote, "A medieval artist or artists would need to be proficient enough in over 100 disciplines and also collectively outweigh the intelligence of the people who performed hundreds and hundreds of tests performed on the shroud and who are not finding any indications of a forgery. This much is certain. The Shroud of Turin is either the most awesome and instructive relic of Jesus Christ in existence or it is one of the most ingenious, most unbelievably clever products of the human mind and hand on record. It is one or the other. There is no middle ground. Who is right? Many objections have been raised, and dozens of books have been written, disputing the authenticity of the shroud, attempting to debunk the claim that it is the authentic burial cloth of Jesus, and arguing that the cloth is a forgery. So in this video, the most common objections will be presented and examined if these claims withstand scrutiny. In 1988, the shroud was subjected to radiocarbon dating. The conclusion was that it originated in the Middle Ages, between 1260 and 1390 AD. Even Leonardo da Vinci was claimed to have forged the Shroud of Turin. Leonardo da Vinci lived during the Renaissance era, which came several centuries later. The first documented historical reference to the shroud dates back to 1355 when it was displayed in Lirey, France. This timeline does not align with Leonardo da Vinci's lifetime, as he was born in 1452 and died in 1519, which is well after the first known appearance of the shroud. In my view, the single most powerful line of evidence that refutes the carbon C14 dating from 1988 of the shroud is the facecloth of Christ, the so-called Sudarium of Oviedo. John 20 verses 6-7 says, "Then Simon Peter came along behind him and went straight into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. When Joseph of Arimathea offered his tomb for the burial of Jesus, it was likely a cochum-style tomb. The main room of the tomb had a bench on its perimeter, which was used to prepare the body before placing it in one of the smaller cochum niches. In 12 to 18 months, the family would return to the tomb, gather the remains from the niche, and placed them in a limestone box called an ossuary. The name sudarium is derived from the Latin word for sweat, sudor. There is a series of amazing coincidences between the two cloths. Both are physically linked. Really fascinating evidence comes to light when this cloth is compared to the Shroud of Turin. There is no doubt that both were in contact with the same individual at one time. The sudarium of Oviedo is a Christian relic that is believed to be a cloth that was used to cover the head of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion. It is kept in Oviedo, Spain. Here we see the sudarium during a procession through the streets of Oviedo in 1942. It is a small, rectangular linen cloth, about 34 by 21 inches, 85.5 by 52.6 centimeters, and is therefore much smaller than the Shroud of Turin. The sudarium's existence is historically confirmed, going back at least to the 6th century, and the radiocarbon testing gave a date, 600 to 700 years earlier than the Shroud of Turin, which brings us much closer to the 1st century. The sudarium bears numerous bloodstains. Some are post-mortem and others vital blood. Denominations were given for each bloodstain. Because the cloth was folded, there is a mirror image of the group of central stains, formed by post-mortem blood flowing from the nose and mouth after death. The bloodstains correspond to a human head. The principal stain was in contact with the face and appears inverted as in a mirror. The principal stain is composed of 3 groups of superimposed stains. It includes symmetric stains, a butterfly stain, an accordion stain, and a crown of thorns stain. These stains provide valuable clues about possible events during the crucifixion and burial of Jesus. The butterfly stain is a unique pattern resembling the shape of a butterfly, and the accordion stain appears lighter in color, possibly indicating blood degradation over time. The crown of thorns stain resembles the pattern of a crown. If the face of the image on the shroud is placed over the stains on the sudarium, perhaps the most obvious coincidence is the exact fit of the stains with the beard on the face. As the sudarium was used to clean the man's face, it appears that it was simply placed on the face to absorb all the blood, but not used in any kind of wiping movement. Let's try to understand what role exactly the sudarium played during and after the crucifixion. It is assumed that Christ's death happened in 33 AD, Friday the 3rd of April, at 3 p.m. The deceased man had undergone a traumatic punishment and had a crown of pointed objects on the head. He was in a vertical position compatible with the cross. While dead, the head of the corpse was inclined forward, about 70 degrees, and 20 degrees to the right, allowing access to the nape. A sudarium was required because blood was believed to contain the person's soul and, according to Jewish law, it was necessary to bury it along with the body. It was also forbidden to move a mutilated body without covering it first. Preliminary anointing of the body was carried out for approximately 1 hour as the body was prepared for transfer to the tomb. This included rewrapping the sudarium over the head, forcing the arms from the position of crucifixion due to the rigor mortis, anointing the body with aloes and myrrh, and covering the body with a cloth. According to Jewish law, washing the body was prohibited when blood flowed at death. According to the bloodstains on the shroud, it appears that the body was not washed, which is in line with Jewish law. There were several conditions under which a corpse was not to be washed, including if the person was a victim of a violent death and if their blood continued to flow at the time of death. Other conditions included if the deceased received capital punishment for a religious crime, was an outcast from the Jewish community, or was murdered by a non-Jew. Jesus would have fulfilled all of these conditions, but any one of them would have disqualified him from being ritually washed. The reason for not washing a body with blood on it is rooted in Jewish religious beliefs. Blood was considered sacred and contained the essence of life. To wash away the blood would be to wash away the essence of the person. Therefore, if a person had been subjected to any of the aforementioned conditions, their blood was kept on the body, and they were not washed. If not, they would be ritually cleaned and then put in the tomb. The importance of keeping the blood on the deceased is evident in several indications from the shroud. For example, the head was wrapped to contain all the fluids, including the blood. After the corpse was dead for 1 hour, at about 4 p.m. someone placed the edge of the sudarium along the nape and wrapped a lock of hair with it, and he sewed the cloth to the hair to fix the sudarium tightly. It was secured with pins, possibly made from thorns, based on the punctures in the cloth. The pins were conical in shape, similar to a needle. About half of the rest of the cloth was passed around the left ear and in front of the face, covering it and reaching the right cheek. There, the cloth was folded to turn back towards the face, providing a second layer in front of the mouth and nose area. In this image, we can see the sequence of how it was folded. It was folded with 2 layers in front of the face of the subject. The cloth was folded back on itself, because it could not completely wrap the head, most likely due to the raised position of the right arm that was still fastened to the cross. As a result, it was doubled back over, creating a repeating parallel stain on a second layer of cloth. It is believed that the head was tilted down to the right, so that it was pressed against the shoulder, and the arms were positioned in a way that resulted in the sudarium being wrapped in this manner. Side, number 1 in the image, seems to mirror the opposite side, number 4. It was folded in the center, the middle of the cloth from top to bottom. That shows where it was folded over on itself. The principal stain is composed of 3 groups of superimposed stains. A trapezoidal stain surrounds the nose and mouth. And here in the folded state. The lines in black overlap and demonstrate the match. The blood on one sheet sucked into the other, and that gave a similar profile of the blood stains. In the image row above, we can see an illustration of how the sudarium was folded. And in the lower 2 images, how the cloth was fixed with pins on the back side of the head, and on his beard, on the front side. The forensic analysis of the cloth leads to the conclusion that it was used around the head of a corpse, stitched to its hair and its beard. It remained in this folded state for about an hour. The cloth was not totally wrapped around his head, probably because some sort of obstacle impeded that operation. The cloth, which was attached to the back of the head, was secured with pins, possibly made from thorns, based on the punctures in the cloth. The pins were conical in shape, similar to a needle. There are a number of perforations, related to the formation of the stains and the original use of the linen. Some of these were produced and the sudarium was fastened to the head of the deceased, using sharp instruments that scientists believe were pinned to the beard and hair. They have a truncated conical nature, and appear in pairs, indicating the possibility that thorns were used. The wrinkles and perforations in the image indicate where the cloth was secured on the beard of the man. The holes circled in blue are surrounding some folds in the fabric, and they cause these folds. The holes circled in red correspond to stitches on the hair. The stitching of the sudarium to the nape hair was the first and involved a single layer. The stitching of the sudarium to the beard involved the 2 layers of the cloth. The lower main stains observed in the sudarium were produced by a mixture of blood and pulmonary edema at the rate of 1 to 6 that flowed slowly from the nose and mouth while the corpse was in a vertical position with the head inclined 70 degrees forward in relation to the vertical axis. Pulmonary edema is characteristic of crucifixion victims. This blood has been determined to be post-mortem blood. The sudarium, therefore, would have to have been placed on the head of a crucified man about 4 p.m., who had died about an hour before. The lower part of the principal stains was formed with the body in a vertical position while hanging on the cross. The body had to have been in that position for 1 hour in order to form the quantity of liquid found on the cloth, with the right arm raised, and the head inclined forward and 20 degrees to the right. Almost an hour after the death, at about 4 p.m., the nose and the mouth of the man started to slowly leak reddish fluid like blood, soaking the beard and mustache. In this position, the lower parts of the main stains were formed. It is important to remember that the bloodstains on the sudarium were formed on a 3-dimensional face and appeared on a flattened cloth. After approximately 1 hour, at about 5 p.m., once the Roman centurion pierced the corpse's thorax, the body was taken down, probably with the arms still fixed to the horizontal beam. For unknown reasons, the caretakers who moved the body decided to turn the corpse face down. In this posture, the nasal flow ran into the back of the nose and soaked the upper part of the main stains that were covering the bridge of the nose and the forehead. The corpse remained like this for almost another hour. This time, the cloth surrounded and was enveloped around the entire head of the cadaver, which was perfectly covered by this sort of capucha or hood that remained fastened to the hair, and a knot was formed. Afterward, the corpse was placed face up, still remaining with 2 layers in front of the face, and his arms were placed along the sides of his body. This movement resulted in an increase in blood leakage from the nose and mouth. Probably at this moment, this flow reached the back of the neck and soaked the corner of the cedarium fixed over the nape, producing the butterfly stain and the corner stain. When the stains on the nape of the neck on both cloths are superimposed, the edge of the cedarium falls on the change of direction of the ponytail on the shroud. It is hypothesized that during the transport of the tomb, a fusion of cadaveric fluids was coming out from the mouth and the nose. And it was attempted to stop them, placing a hand over the maculating effluent in diverse positions. Probably another cloth was used to carry Jesus to the tomb, which was not the Shroud of Turin. Let's give a closer look now at the principal stain, which is composed of 3 groups of superimposed stains. Dr. Villalane Blanco, a Spanish criminologist and forensic physician, directed the blood study to determine the nature of the stains and how they were formed. The techniques were carried out in the laboratories of criminology and forensic biology at the schools of forensic medicine in Madrid and Valencia. The principal stain is composed of 3 groups of superimposed stains. A trapezoidal stain surrounds the nose and mouth, which scientists believe was formed by the pressure of a closed fist that was exerting pressure on the nose in order to contain the flow of blood. The trapezoidal stain was one of the last to be formed because it only appears on the first 2 surfaces of the cloth. It is believed that the finger-shaped stains were formed when the body was being moved to another location, in an effort to suppress the flow of blood from the nose and mouth. There are several stains that are marks left from the fingers, trying to suppress the flow of blood and pulmonary fluid. Finally, later, at 6 p.m., the cloth was removed and sprinkled with aloes and styrax, a substitute for myrrh, and put on the head again. Now we look here in the upper right-hand corner of the actual cedarium, and you have a bunch of these wrinkles or folds, and this is a mock-up here on the right. This would have probably been where the knot was formed, so we still have evidence of the knot that was tied to fix the cedarium on the head of the victim. It is interesting that a 5th century manuscript mentions that the cedarium was knotted at the top of the head. The author, Nonos of Panopolis, was paraphrasing the Gospel of John, chapter 20, and added this detail. After the body was moved, it was positioned face up, and the cloth was removed from the head, still knotted. It was covered with aloe and myrrh to preserve the blood, according to Jewish custom, and set apart in the tomb. Finally, the cedarium had to be removed from the corpse because it was sprinkled with aloes, which are still imbibed in the blood and remain on the surface that had been in contact with the face. It implies that the cedarium was no longer wrapping the head. We resume the sequence of events as follows. Jesus' death happened at 3 p.m. The cedarium was placed around man's head almost an hour after his death, around 4 p.m., when he was still on the cross. He remained in a vertical position with the cedarium for about another hour. Around 5 p.m., the body was taken down and the corpse was left face down. The corpse remained like this for almost another hour. Afterward, around 6 p.m., the corpse was placed face up and moved to the tomb. Just before the corpse was covered with the shroud, the cedarium was removed. In the case of Jesus, there was not much time. So the shroud was probably just wrapped and laid over his body, as shown in the image above. We can assume that the cedarium with the blood of the deceased man had to be buried near him in the sepulchre if the burial was a Jewish entombment. The cedarium was put aside close to the corpse in the sepulchre. Let's give a look at the coincidences that evidence that the cedarium wrapped the same man of the Shroud of Turin. Both clothes have been used for a bearded man with mustache and long hair arranged behind in a ponytail. The shroud shows a crucified man and the corpse of the cedarium died in an upright position. Moreover, in both cases, the executed man was tortured with a crown of thorns. Finally, in both instances, the blood corresponds to the scarce type AB. It is easy to see the back of the hair in the shroud image. If we look carefully and use the reinforced negative image, we can clearly see long hair falling from the bottom of the nape of the neck to the space between the shoulder blades. The ponytail can also be observed on both clothes. The ponytail could be a result of the attachment and sewing of the cedarium around the central back strand of hair. There is a distinction on the cloth between lifeblood and post-mortem blood. One can distinguish that from taking samples from the cloth, and the blood that came out through the nose and mouth mixed with the pleural edema fluid is post-mortem blood. Forensic analysis of the bloodstains suggests strongly that both the cedarium and the shroud covered the same human head at closely different times. Bloodstain patterns show that the cedarium was placed about the man's head while he was still in a vertical position, presumably before he was removed from the cross. It was then removed before the shroud was placed over the man's face. There are many points of coincidence between all these points and the Shroud of Turin, the blood group, the way the corpse was tortured and died, and the macroscopic overlay of the stains on each cloth. This is especially notable in that the blood on the cedarium, shed in life as opposed to post-mortem, corresponds exactly in blood group, blood type, and surface area to those stains on the shroud on the nape of the neck. If it is clear that the two cloths must have covered the same corpse, and this conclusion is inevitable from all the studies carried out up to date, and if the history of the cedarium can be trustworthily extended back beyond the 14th century, which is often referred to as the shroud's first documented historical appearance, then this would take the shroud back to at least the earliest dates of the cedarium's known history. The Ark of Relics and the cedarium have without any doubt at all been in Spain since the beginning of the 7th century, and the history recorded in various manuscripts from various times and geographical areas takes it all the way back to Jerusalem in the 1st century. The importance of this for shroud history cannot be overstressed. Dr. Alan Wanger developed a method of overlaying images in different light polarizations to find what he calls points of congruence and published the technique in the journal Optics. This technique has now been widely adopted in the U.S. courts with anywhere from 45 to 60 points of congruence between two images being sufficient to prove common identity in the U.S. court of law. Dr. Wanger used this same technique to compare the blood stains on the cedarium and the Shroud of Turin with startling results. The frontal stains on the cedarium show 70 points of coincidence with the shroud, and the rear side shows 50. It is hypothesized that these are the stains observed in the cedarium that were produced coming from the nose and mouth, probably while the corpse was in a vertical position with the head inclined 70 degrees forward in relation to the vertical axis. The upper red arrow shows the stain from the nose, and the lower red arrow shows the stain from the mouth. Numbers 1, 2, and 3 on the shroud correspond to marks on the cedarium. These are just a few among many others that have been detected. It is important to remember that the bloodstains on the cedarium were formed on a three-dimensional face and appeared on a flattened cloth. It is therefore necessary to eliminate the extra 2 centimeters formed by the base of the nose to see how the stains conform to a face. The nose is 8 centimeters long, with an extra 2 centimeters from the base of the nose. Once we move up the cloth about 2 centimeters, the central stains align with the mouth and the nose. Professor Monaro, who is the director of the sculpture department at the University of Seville, Spain, has conducted a geometric. He reconstructed the anatomical elements that are present in the head of the cedarium, and has found that they match exactly with the Shroud of Turin. Not only do the overall dimensions of the head and the shroud match, but also the bloodstains on the shroud correspond exactly with the wounds on the head. If we place the shroud and the cedarium, face cloth, together and focus on the bloodstains, there are numerous similarities. For example, there is a blood-free area on the cedarium that corresponds to swelling on the face of the shroud with almost perfect accuracy. There are several other elements that match perfectly as well, but explaining them one by one would be too much detail. Furthermore, it is atypical to find soil dirt in this zone of the anatomy, but it is just the same zone where a particular presence of dust was found in the Shroud of Turin. The very low concentration of strontium traces in the cedarium matches also well with the type of limestone characteristic of the Rock of Calvary in Jerusalem. Stains from puncture wounds are on the part of the cloth that covered the back of the head, composed of vital blood that flowed before death had occurred. The cloth was applied to these wounds about 60 minutes after they had bled, or 1 hour after the person had died. These are the most interesting and significant blood stains on the cloth, for the simple reason that they match the stains on the Shroud of Turin. They match both as a fairly close pattern, but also they're both the same blood type. Which is maybe the same blood group and the same blood type, in other words, bloodshed in life, and it's a blood type that was not particularly common in Europe but was more common in the Middle East. As we have seen, there are many parallels between the man on the shroud and the man of the Sidarium. Many different anatomical elements as well correspond to the faces of the shroud and the Sidarium. There are many points in common between the two that are undeniable. It is rational to conclude that they wrapped the same man. But the coincidences do not end here. Scientists have determined that the Sidarium is made of linen with a twist, the most common type of weave in the Roman Empire. It has a taffeta texture, the simplest type of weave, and it does not have selvages on any of its edges, or any dye. The linen has a large number of defects, such as loops, loose basting stitches, and the crossing of parallel threads of the woof, indicating that the cloth was made on a vertical loom with weights and that it is very old, likely from the 1st century. There are about 30 types of pollen grains, at least 9 grow in Palestine, a point of comparison with the Shroud of Turin. Quercus, holm oak and kermes oak, Pistacia palestina, mastic tree and terebinth tree, and tamarix, tamarind tree and salt cedar, only grow in Palestine. The analysis of the white particles found on the linen was especially difficult, and they were finally identified as particles of resin of aloe and myrrh. There are clusters of myrrh, more specifically storax, and aloe. A mixture similar to that which, according to the Gospels, was used profusely at the burial of Jesus. It is mentioned directly in the Gospel of John, Nicodemus came as well, and he brought a mixture of myrrh and aloes. They took the body of Jesus and bound it in linen cloths with the spices, following the Jewish burial custom. Something revealing was found that links this fabric to some kind of funerary custom, some particles that are found attached to the shroud's own blood. Storax is a natural resin obtained from the bark of various species of trees. It has a sweet, balsamic aroma and is commonly used in perfumes, cosmetics, and incense. Storax was used in burials in Palestine during the 1st century. Storax was one of the materials used in the process of embalming or preparing bodies for burial according to the customs of the time. Storax was known for its aromatic properties, and it was used as an ingredient in perfumes and ointments that were applied to the body to mask odors and preserve the corpse. Storax was believed to have medicinal properties as well, and it was used as an antiseptic and an anti-inflammatory agent in the embalming process. The use of storax in burial practices during the 1st century in Palestine is supported by historical accounts, including references in ancient texts and inscriptions, as well as archaeological discoveries of storax residues and storage containers in tombs and burial sites in the region. It was also established that there is human blood in the Sidarium. The clinical tests were positive for globulin, and it is blood from group AB, the same as that of the shroud. The blood, with some specific exceptions, is blood mixed with another liquid. It is a mixture of 1 part of blood with 6 of the serum, specifically taken from pulmonary edema. The human nature of the blood was confirmed by the identification of mitochondrial DNA. In 2012, scientists detected the presence of structures that are compatible with dried blobs of fibrin. The most likely hypothesis is that such blobs were formed within a body cavity, pleural and/or pericardial. To reach such a condition, the individual must undergo severe trauma, as the scourging and a few hours must elapse to allow the fibrin formation before the fluid is released. The fibrin accumulated in the pleural cavity needs a path to reach the Sidarium. This path could be the wound from the spear that connected the cavity with the respiratory tract. In the Sidarium of Oviedo, the presence of these fibrin blobs free from blood elements could be another indirect proof of the scourging, because the formation of fibrin requires a previous injury. This is the most plausible hypothesis for the formation of the fibrin elements. To reach the Sidarium, the fibrin could flow out through the nose and the mouth, together with blood and the liquid of the edema from the lungs. Samples from the Sudarium were subject to carbon dating. At the Second International Conference on the Sudarium of Oviedo, in Spain, in 2007, it was reported that the sample from the Sudarium was dated to around 700 AD, while the history of the Sudarium is very well established and there are definite references to its presence in Jerusalem in AD 570 and at the beginning of the 5th century. In 1990, the Sudarium of Oviedo was dated by the carbon-14 method. 2 samples of the Sudarium were dated which were cut out in 1979. Macro photographs of these samples sent to Arizona and Toronto are shown in the image above. There was uncertainty about the conditions of conservation of the samples from they were taken, 1979, until they were radiocarbon tested. One of the earliest references to the Sudarium of Oviedo is found in the writings of Antoninus of Piacenza, an Italian pilgrim who visited Jerusalem in AD 570. Antoninus described a cloth that was believed to be the Sudarium or sweat cloth of Jesus. The oldest surviving manuscript of Antoninus' account of his pilgrimage visiting Jerusalem in AD 570 is a Latin manuscript entitled Itinerarium Antonini Placentini Peregrinatio ad Loca Sancta, translated, The Journey of Antoninus of Piacenza to the Holy Places. This manuscript is preserved in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, France, and is dated to the 8th century. It is a handwritten copy of Antoninus' travel diary and provides valuable insights into the Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land during the late antique period. Chapter 12 of the story of the pilgrimage reads, There is a cave on the bank of the Jordan, where there are 7 cells with 7 girls, who are put there as little children. Whenever any of them dies, she is buried in the cell, and another cell is built and another girl is put there, so that there are always the same number. People from outside prepare their food. We entered this place with great fear to pray, but we saw nobody. The Sudarium that covered Jesus' head is said to be there. Ancient documents relate that the Sudarium was safeguarded in Jerusalem until the Persian invasion of 614 AD. The Christians fled to Spain with a chest filled with relics, stopping briefly in Alexandria, Egypt. The chest remained in Seville during the time of Saint Isidore, and was transferred to Toledo after his death in 636 AD. When the Muslims invaded Spain in 711 AD, they quickly conquered Toledo, so the Christians absconded to the north with their relics. The holy chest was hidden on a mountaintop near Oviedo for 50 years. The relics were then transferred to a monastery in Oviedo until King Alphonsus II built the Holy Chamber in the year 812 AD, now part of the cathedral. All the studies carried out so far point in one direction, with nothing to suggest the contrary. The Sudarium was used to cover the head of the dead body of Jesus of Nazareth from when he was taken down from the cross until he was buried. The Sudarium provides strong, independent evidence for the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. If the shroud is a fake, then the Sudarium must also be so. Such a wide range of evidences as presented here strengthens the tradition that both cloths have wrapped the same body, that of Jesus of Nazareth. This makes the job of any potential forger close to impossible. The 2 cloths authenticate and validate each other, and together they provide a strong case for being the original burial cloths of Jesus. And both coincide and fit perfectly the Gospel accounts. Carbon dating. One of the most significant arguments against the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin is the results of carbon dating tests that were conducted in 1988. This finding has been used as evidence against the shroud's authenticity, suggesting that it could be a medieval forgery rather than the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. The carbon dating results from the 1988 tests are often cited as a significant argument against the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin because they provide a direct scientific measurement that places the shroud's origin in the Middle Ages. This finding challenges the belief that the shroud could be a relic from the time of Jesus Christ, as it suggests that it was created much later in history. The carbon dating tests were conducted by 3 independent laboratories at the University of Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich. Using radiocarbon dating, which is a widely accepted scientific method for dating organic materials. They indicated a medieval date range, leading many to question the shroud's authenticity. The test results were one of the most eagerly awaited scientific announcements of all time. A radiocarbon dating test was done on a piece of cloth taken from the corner of the shroud. There were a lot of problems with dating, problems that are still discussed today. When the sample was taken, there was a discussion for more than an hour about from which area the sample should be taken. It was taken from a corner that experts had advised against because a corner was missing, and it was also an area that was held often by clergy during expositions. It had also been suggested that more than one area be tested to make sure that the sample tested was representative of the whole cloth. Instead, only one sample was taken from the suspect corner and given to 3 different labs. There are 3 main arguments brought forward disputing the dating results. One is the medieval repair, the second is the biocontamination, and the third, the carbon monoxide one. Another argument is that the sudarium from Oviedo matches in several aspects the Shroud of Turin, and it is very likely that it covered the same man as the Shroud of Turin, and it is radiocarbon dated to the 7th century. One of the first ideas, immediately after the dating results, put forth by syndenologists and archaeologists as the late Paul Maloney on the left, the late Maria Grazia Ciliato, and William Meacham, was that the area from which the C14 sample was taken had been repaired, which would have thrown off the range given to the final tabulation results. Sue Benford, and Joe Marino, started to look seriously into this hypothesis around early 2000. Marino studied the shroud for 45 years and innumerable hours. He wrote 2 books and dozens of articles about it. He and Benford concluded that based on the evidence they found, the sample dated was a combination of 1st century cloth and 16th century cloth. In 2000, Sue Benford and her husband Joe Marino shared a photo of the sample that was carbon dated by the lab in Zurich with 3 textile experts. The photo was shared blind, in that the textile experts were not told the photo was of the shroud, or told what to look for. All experts who were given photos noted differences between the left and right sides. One noted, "There is no question that there is different material on each side, it is definitely a patch." Another said, "The float is different on either side of the sample." In France, there was a method called French invisible reweaving, used by master weavers in the 16th century. The weaver replaces each broken thread, one at a time. The late Stirp chemist Raymond Rogers had access to samples that were radiocarbon dated. After analyzing the samples, he had to admit what Benford and Joe Marino hypothesized was right: the original linen shroud contained additional cotton threads. The samples from the cloth that was radiocarbon dated had cotton in them. He published a science paper in 2004, concluding that the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original linen of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid for determining the true age of the shroud. The raw data from the 3 labs, which the labs, against all norms, refused to release immediately, were finally obtained through a Freedom of Information request in 2017. Careful analysis of that data supports the notion that the shroud sample dated in 1988 was a combination of 1st and 16th century cloth. This hypothesis has been disputed. For example, we read in John Loftus' book, Christianity, in the Light of Science, as follows: "The alleged patched area exists only hypothetically and is based on the circular reasoning of shroud defenders." Moreover, a team of Italian chemists presented a scientific paper demonstrating that Rogers's mass spectrometry pyrolysis spectra did not support his assertions. They called the hypothesis of the carbon-14 sample having been taken from a patched area unsupported and, indeed, pseudoscientific. So how sound is this objection? Let's give a closer look. Multiple lines of evidence show that the samples came from a repaired corner. The Savoy family ruled over the region of Turin in Italy for several centuries. The Savoys owned the shroud from 1453 until 1983. In the late 16th century, Duke Emmanuel Philibert of Savoy ordered the shroud to be transferred from Chambéry, France, to Turin, Italy, where it has been kept since then. The shroud had been kept in Chambéry, France, and the Duke feared that it might be damaged or destroyed due to political turmoil and religious conflicts in France. He decided to move the shroud to his capital city of Turin in Italy, which was under his control and considered a safer location. The Duke was devoutly religious and had a personal devotion to the shroud. He believed that the shroud was a genuine relic of Jesus Christ and wanted to bring it to Turin as a sign of his faith and piety. He hoped that by having the shroud in his capital, it would bring prestige to his reign and enhance the religious significance of Turin. The shroud would also attract pilgrims and tourists, thus boosting the local economy and consolidating the Savoy's political power in the region. King Umberto II of Italy, whose family used to own the shroud, says that in 1694 they repaired the shroud's heavily frayed and missing edges. Umberto described how, according to his family tradition, in generations past his family gave threads from up to 10 centimeters inward from the edges of the shroud as gifts. In the past, the edges of the sheet had become so tattered as to cause embarrassment or criticism of the custodians, and those areas were repaired and rewoven, attempting to blend the new sections in, as best possible, with the original fabric. Vittorio Amadeo II, along with his wife, the Infanta Anna d'Orleans, personally assisted Sebastiano Valfer on June 6, 1694, in repairing the burial cloth shortly before transferring the relic to the new chapel of the Guarini. Furthermore, even earlier, in 1532, there was a fire in the church in Chambéry, France, where the shroud was being kept. On April 16, 1534, Chambéry's Poor Clare nuns repaired the shroud, sewing it onto a backing cloth, the Holland cloth, and sewing patches over the unsightliness of the damage. This became known as the Holland backing cloth. The removal of all patches and of the reinforcement Holland cloth backing of the shroud, in the year 2002, confirmed what King Umberto had stated. Namely, that small sections of the repaired and rewoven edges had continually been removed from the relic. In 2002, high-resolution images of each corner of the shroud were made. The shroud becomes much darker toward the corners, either with contamination from many hands holding it by the edges throughout history, or with the edges being repaired and subsequently dyed to a similar color to match. In this image, we see the approximate locations of the questionable area used for C14 dating in the laboratories in Arizona, Zurich, and Oxford, in reference to the full frontal portion of the shroud. One of the numerous scientific tests conducted in 1978 by Stirp included spectrally resolved quad-mosaic photography. This study, utilizing state-of-the-art NASA technology of the time, was designed to generate color discriminability products capable of conducting a chemical distribution analysis of the surface of the linen cloth. According to the Stirp researchers in charge of this study, the generation of color products was considered the most important image processing task. From a color-enhanced, relative color display, the color of different features of the image can be compared. The colors, of course, indicate different chemical compositions. Researchers at the University of Kent explained that multispectral imaging entails acquiring several images of the same scene using different spectral bands. For instance, a digital color camera detects 3 separate images for the red, green, and blue components of light. The Stirp authors noted that if the chemicals were spectrally differentiated, the multispectral classification process could provide a map of chemical composition throughout the shroud image. According to textile historian Mechthild Fleury-Lemberg, who observed the area during her work to restore the shroud in 2002, the shroud's missing corner pieces, which were already missing prior to the 1532 fire, were added during repairs made due to fire damages in 1532. In the image, we can see the Holland backing cloth, which goes underneath the Oxford, Arizona, and Zurich sample areas, and where it was seamed. Both the exposed Holland cloth and the adjacent radiocarbon sample area are a uniform dark green color. Images of the larger dorsal missing corner piece section, also exposing some of the Holland cloth, have a completely different chemical color signature, consisting of a myriad of lighter-toned colors. Soon after the radiocarbon test was published, in 1988, Raymond Schneider published a science paper, worth mentioning. He wrote, "When the carbon-14 dating of the Shroud of Turin result was announced in 1988, the tests concluded that the shroud was woven of flax whose age was estimated to be between 1260 and 1390 AD. This result flew in the face of many expectations of authenticity but was welcomed by many as revealing the shroud to be simply inauthentic, and it was then popularly heralded as a fake." However, this rush to judgment contradicted most of the science and scholarship previously invested in the shroud. It is perhaps a measure of the respect in which C14 dating is held that the finding tended to discredit the earlier work, yet it is a questionable scientific practice to vest one kind of result with such weight as to completely discount the results of a large body of prior work. Indeed, I might add to that, 25 multidisciplinary tests of the STURP team are simply dismissed, in favor of a highly questionable carbon C14 test for which there are excellent reasons to believe that it was invalid. The recommendations involved more than 3 labs, a mix of both counter labs and AMS, accelerator mass spectrometry, labs, and most importantly samples from multiple sites. The decision to limit the dating to 3 labs, using only the AMS method and restricting the sampling to a single highly contaminated site were all outcomes determined by a politicized and highly bureaucratic process of Byzantine proportions. The blue quad mosaic image is a multispectral false color image which reflects the surface chemical composition of the shroud. It rather clearly shows that the sample region just to the right of the raised patch covering the sample taken in 1973 is different from the rest of the cloth. Although more subtle, the UV fluorescent image taken by Vern Miller is also darker in that region, and this can be seen in both the UV fluorescent image as presented and in the false color image resulting from John Morgan's analysis. These images establish the poor choice of the region near the raised sample, and had there been a significant study of the site selection for the dating would likely not have been selected. But there wasn't. Both the exposed Holland cloth and the adjacent radiocarbon sample area are a uniform dark green color. Images of the larger dorsal missing corner piece section, also exposing some of the Holland cloth, have a completely different chemical color signature, consisting of a myriad of lighter toned colors. The dark green encompasses the side seam and extends approximately an inch, 3 centimeters, into the main shroud cloth region. Similar solid geometric patterns with defined borders in this hue are not observable elsewhere on the cloth. This is one line of evidence that permits the hypothesis that the cloth sent to the 3 laboratories for the radiocarbon C14 testing consisted partially of restorative surface dyes that were attached by invisible medieval repair, and partially to the original cloth. A well-supported estimate, based upon weave pattern changes, has been posited reflecting approximately 60% of the C14 sample consisting of 16th century threads, while approximately 40% were 1st century in origin. The radiocarbon date was calculated using the percentage of observed the 16th century versus 1st century weave types appearing in the Oxford subsample. STURP chemist Ray Rogers, microscopist John L. Brown, and Pam Moon each independently examined fibers within and or near the carbon-dated sample. They found a plant gum, likely gum arabic, a common ingredient in tempera paints, is a major presence, coating the carbon dating sample threads. In contrast, Rogers reported that no sample from the main part of the shroud showed any feature even remotely similar to the coating in the anomalous area. Brown described the dye as obvious evidence of a medieval artisan's attempt to dye a newly added repair region of fabric to match the aged appearance of the remainder of the shroud. As mentioned before, the reweaving hypothesis has been disputed. Not only by John Loftus in his book. Many different objections have been raised. It would extrapolate this video to go into all the objections. I recommend investigating for yourself. Dive deep into the science, go beyond the surface, and be honest with yourself. We are not short of methods offered to us to do our investigations, like the internet, books, seminaries, and other ways. Do not simply stick to what you want to be true, but try to follow the evidence, no matter where it leads, even if not in your desired direction and conclusion. The second argument against the reliability of the carbon dating test is the biocontamination. Even before the radiocarbon dating took place, in March 1986, archaeologist William Meacham, quoted earlier in this video, presented a paper entitled Radiocarbon Measurement and the Age of the Turin Shroud, Possibilities and Uncertainties, at a symposium on the shroud. The C14 dating method often gives brilliant results but has limited reliability. Although the theoretical principles are well-founded, when applied in real conditions, a non-negligible percentage of measurements provide aberrant results that archaeologists consider invalid. 24% of the tested results are on average either doubtful or unacceptable. In the paper, He warned in regard to radiocarbon dating about contamination of samples, particularly by carbon from other sources. He wrote, "The existence of significant indeterminate errors can never be excluded from any age determination. No method is immune from giving grossly incorrect datings when there are non-apparent problems with the samples originating in the field. The results illustrated, in this paper, show that this situation occurs frequently." Emphasis added. Regardless of the C14 result, evidence from other sources would of course remain of considerable importance in the overall evaluation of the age and origin of the relic. A C14 age later than the 1st century would not of course constitute scientific proof of the inauthenticity of the shroud, since radiocarbon dating is based on a number of unverifiable assumptions, the most important in this context being that the carbon extracted from the sample is indeed identical with the carbon absorbed from the environment when the sample was alive. The third argument against radiocarbon dating is that it has been observed that carbon monoxide in the sea-level atmosphere is significantly enriched in radiocarbon well above that found in normal biogenic quantities derived from carbon dioxide. Only about a 2% carbon contamination relative to the overall carbon in the sample would be required to move a 1st century date of the shroud textile to the 14th century. According to archaeologist Eugenia Nitovsky, in archaeology if there are 10 lines of evidence, carbon dating being one of them and it conflicts with the other 9, there is little hesitation to throw out the carbon date as inaccurate due to unforeseen contamination. The biblical narratives related to the passion and death of Jesus confirm the authenticity of the Shroud of Turin. And the Shroud of Turin confirms the authenticity of the Gospels. So 25 multidisciplinary tests of the STURP team are simply dismissed, in favor of a highly debated carbon C14 test for which there are excellent reasons to believe that it was invalid. There is no conclusive proof that the radiocarbon test provided results according to what really happened, and pieces of evidence must be weighed in the context of all the available evidence in order to be judged. When one makes a web search, is the Shroud of Turin fake? An article published in 2018 pops up first. It starts with the following claim: forensic scientists have once again concluded that the Shroud of Turin, supposedly the burial cloth of Jesus was wrapped in after his crucifixion, was artificially created. The conclusions of the study suggest that the bloodstain pattern analysis performed on the Turin shroud demonstrates that the alleged flowing patterns of blood from different areas of the body are not consistent with each other. Moreover, the authors hypothesize that post-mortem bleeding to generate the lines on the lumbar area, belt of blood, seems to be unrealistic. Based on these inconsistencies, the study suggests that the Turin shroud was not an authentic artifact but rather an artistic or didactic representation from the 14th century. It seems to me that, based on these supposed inconsistencies, concluding that the shroud is a forgery, is taken out from thin air. There are good reasons to reject such a conclusion. The study has been heavily criticized by forensic anthropologists. Alfonso Sanchez Hermosilla, for example, wrote, "The article presents numerous formal and conceptual errors that deprive it of scientific credibility. The experiment does not even remotely reproduce the conditions in which the blood stains of the Turin shroud have occurred. In these circumstances, the conclusions of the article are totally devoid of scientific value." The authors of the article, given their inexperience and lack of the minimum necessary knowledge, have committed serious errors in planning and interpreting the results of their experiment. The article is not suitable for publication in a specialized scientific journal. It is assumed that people who have assessed the suitability of the article should have the necessary knowledge and experience. In the case in question, either they do not possess it or have ignored it for unknown reasons. A more recent paper from 2019, which didn't make it into popular news journals, concluded, "Our forensic analysis was based on live suspensions on a cross with volunteer subjects, a methodology that was not used by Barini and Garlashelli, and our conclusion of the scientific experiments and analyses of the same blood flows have reached the opposite conclusion. The blood pattern on the shroud, in reality, permits to make precise studies and describes the painful movement that the individual made on the cross. The characteristic bloodstain on the left wrist formed by two diverging streaks, for example, is particularly notable, as it indicates two different positions assumed by the condemned man on the cross. The BPA study used only one single individual. Therefore, it may not be representative of all individuals who were crucified, and the conclusions drawn may not be universally applicable. The study acknowledges the possibility of different episodes of bleeding, such as movements of the body or post-mortem bleeding. It does not provide any definitive proof that such episodes did not occur and could not have contributed to the bloodstain patterns on the shroud. The conclusion that the shroud was an artistic or didactic representation from the 14th century is entirely based on assumptions and is by no means definitive proof. Garcla Shelley seems to have made it a life mission to discredit the Shroud of Turin. His book, The Shroud on Trial, was published in 1998. In 2010 he published a science paper, Life-Size Reproduction of the Shroud of Turin and Its Image. His thesis was that linen can be aged artificially by heating it and then washing it in water. Next, red ochre, iron oxide, could be applied to a body, and the linen cloth then could be rubbed over the body's prominent features. After that, the blood stains, burn holes, scorches, and water stains could be added for the final effect. Garcla Shelley tried to reproduce the image on the shroud. He ordered a herringbone linen cloth exactly the same as that of the shroud, both in terms of yarn type and weight. The cloth was spread over a volunteer, and only the most prominent parts were rubbed with a reddish ochre pad. The image was then finished freehand after having spread the cloth on a flat surface. We have in fact ascertained that it is not possible to apply the color with the pad in a uniform way when the body is still under the cloth. The face alone was made with a plaster bas-relief. This is the only way to avoid a complete distortion of the features and obtain a result similar to the face of the shroud. Garcla Shelley claimed in the paper that the image on the shroud is made up of two components, an iron oxide pigment on the fibers and a uniform yellow coloring throughout many of the fibers. It's common knowledge that iron oxide was a regular ingredient in many medieval paints. Garcla Shelley was not the first coming up with that hypothesis. Macron, in the 80s, as well concluded that the shroud was simply a beautiful painting. He then celebrated the result on TV, claiming, "Our results seem encouraging and should be welcomed as an interesting contribution to the resolution of doubts about what is the mysterious object par excellence." The premise of the iron oxide argument is simple: some iron oxide is rubbed on the shroud. Except that virtually no iron oxide particles have been found on the shroud at all, let alone the millions of particles you'd expect would cover it all. Professor Garcla Shelley tried to explain the absence of any traces of iron oxide on the original shroud by stating that the pigment on the original shroud faded away naturally over the centuries. This is not a statement that you would expect from a serious scientist. The spectroscopic investigations being done in 1978 would even show the slightest traces of iron oxide present on the shroud, and it is a totally unscientific to state that they disappeared naturally, being a unsupported, just so, assertion. This also doesn't explain the bloodstains. There's no image under the bloodstains, whilst every attempt to replicate the shroud by using iron oxide always adds the bloodstains after. A forger would have to literally add the bloodstains in the correct positions, then rub iron oxide around it perfectly. And around the bloodstains are fluorescent serum halos, which haven't been explained or replicated by proponents of this theory either. And to top it off, the shroud can be used to make a 3D model whilst the iron oxide rubbed image has no 3D properties at all. The opinion of many was that the reproduced shroud was so ridiculously far off that it was not evidence against but rather evidence in favor of the impossibility to reproduce all the fine intricacies of the original. The result was soon archived and not mentioned any further. A lot of criticism rained down on the association that backed up and financed the experiment, especially from many experts, believers and non-believers alike. Many other attempts besides Garcla Shelley's to replicate the shroud have been made over the years, but none with successful results. But who are the authors of the article? Luigi Garcla Shelley is an Italian chemist from the University of Pavia. Barini, an anthropologist, claims to be a Catholic, and Garla Shelley is an atheist and skeptic with a flying spaghetti monster logo prominent on his blog, so make of that what you will. The UAR, or Union of Atheists and Agnostic Rationalists. Don't tell me they didn't have an agenda. To our next point, another very common reason skeptics give for saying that the Shroud of Turin is a forgery, is a statement by Bishop Pierre d'Arcis of Troyes, France, in 1389, that his predecessor Henri de Poitiers, about 34 years earlier, had gotten a confession from the artist who supposedly painted the Shroud of Turin. To understand, let's give a closer look at the historical context of the story. In 1204, during the Fourth Crusader campaign, Crusader armies captured, looted, and destroyed parts of Constantinople, then the capital of the Byzantine Empire. Reports of Crusader looting and brutality scandalized and horrified the Orthodox world. In 1205, Theodore Angelus, a member of the Byzantine aristocracy in Greece, wrote, probably on behalf of other members of his social class, to Pope Innocent III, expressing how they were outraged by the Crusaders' actions. The historical document provides insight into the events surrounding the event. In the letter, Angelus protests against the Crusaders' looting of Constantinople and the desecration of important religious artifacts, including the most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death. After the sack of Constantinople, a great silence in the Shroud history begins. There is some evidence that it went to Athens with Othon de la Roche, who became the first Frankish lord of Athens in 1204. He may have sent it back to France, or perhaps it entered the custody of the Knights Templar and was used in their initiation rites. The story that connects the two theories has yet to be written. However, there is significant evidence that both are true in some way. Until Geoffrey I de Charny, a French knight, came into possession of the Shroud of Turin around the 1350s, probably a gift from King Philip for his services. He built a small, wooden church in tiny Liray, outside the city of Troyes, France, where he was lord, to house various relics. De Charny kept the shroud in his castle at Liray and occasionally exhibited it to the public. The exhibitions of the shroud in Liray attracted thousands of pilgrims and visitors, who came to see the cloth and venerate it as a sacred relic. In the meantime, in 1353, Henri of Poitiers, an abbé from the vicinity, was appointed Bishop of Troyes, Liray's nearest large city. This small lead medallion was made to celebrate pilgrim visitation to shroud expositions in Liray, in the mid-14th century. It depicts two clerics, which heads are missing, holding up, with crossed arms, the shroud. This is the first certain picture of the shroud, complete with both the back and front images, even capturing the shroud's herringbone weave. In 1389, the French Bishop of Troyes, Pierre d'Arcis, wrote an angry memorandum to Avignon Pope Clement VII. d'Arcis declared that about 34 years earlier, 1355, the Liray church's dean, the chief cleric, had obtained the cloth, falsely and deceitfully, to milk the pilgrim trade, and had even hired individuals to pretend they had been healed miraculously during expositions. He went on to claim that his predecessor at that time, Henri de Poitiers, Bishop of Troyes between 1353 and 1370, had been advised by theologians against the possibility of the cloth's authenticity, and, after further investigation, he discovered the fraud and how the said cloth had been cunningly painted, the truth having been attested by the artist who had painted it, to wit, that it was a work of human skill and not miraculously wrought or bestowed. Supposedly Henri then tried to confiscate the cloth, but the dean hid it until, in d'Arcis' time, a new dean, also, with fraudulent intent and for the purpose of gain, initiated a new round of expositions, with the assistance of Geoffrey II. d'Arcis was particularly piqued as Geoffrey II had circumvented the bishop's authority by recently securing permission from a cardinal, the Pope's representative. The memorandum of Pierre d'Arcis appears to make a strong case against the shroud's authenticity and has formed the cornerstone for skeptical historical judgment, especially during the 20th century. First and foremost, where did the bishop obtain his information about Henri de Poitiers and the painter who supposedly produced the relic? It was not from any known documentation. d'Arcis was a competent lawyer before